We are diving into Debussy, and we hope we don't give you the wrong impression. Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, and that's Mozart. Lately we've been talking a lot on the channel about what we kind of struggle with as modern audiences in connecting with different art forms, especially ones that are from time periods that we sort of lost touch with. And I think one of the ways that can be really helpful for that is to not just look at the art form itself, such as art, song, or opera, but to also look at sort of the cultural and artistic trends that were happening around that genre in other art forms. And so that's what we're going to do today with Claude Debussy's Apparition. Debussy is a composer who is often associated with the different visual art movements of his time, most especially Impressionism. But it's actually not a term that he himself felt connected with his music, and it was actually a critic who first called him an Impressionist composer. And this is because what Debussy was doing was stretching the conventions of the music world to such an extent that when audiences and critics heard it, they really didn't know how to put their finger on what was happening. So they just compared it to the biggest rule-breaking movement in art at the time, which was Impressionism. Impressionism was an artistic movement that was particularly popular in France around the 1870s and 1880s. And some of the huge painters of that movement include Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, and Camille Pissarro, and many, many more. The idea behind the Impressionist movement was that it was completely breaking away from the solid, structured, and detailed artistic conventions of the time. And so what the Impressionists wanted to do was to create a painting and create a world in which you were getting the impression of an image rather than all of the specific details. And so it's really easy to see why critics and audiences felt that Debussy's music was impressionist, because up until that time, many composers were sort of stretching the musical rules as far as they could go, but Debussy started to actually recreate them and reuse them in non-conventional ways. And so you can imagine that hearing, especially those first orchestral pieces of his, that he wasn't following the rules of detail and convention and was instead giving an impression of the music. So that's how Debussy became synonymous with Impressionism in music. But if we take a closer look at the artistic movements that were actually budding and blossoming at the same time that Debussy was creating many of his most famous pieces, we can see that there's a deep relationship with symbolism and that it was something that inspired him, especially, I think, in his vocal works. Symbolism was a movement that certainly affected painting and had a branch in the painting world, but it actually started in the literary world. And it was very popular in France in the 1890s, but many of the French poets who wrote in that style were actually inspired by Edgar Allan Poe. And like Impressionism, symbolism wanted to break away from the solid conventional rules of prior art forms. But unlike Impressionism, which sought to blur the lines of reality to give us a different perspective, symbolism wanted to break with reality altogether to give us a more ethereal and spiritual experience. And so it completely abandoned the notions of precise detail and replaced it with a dreamlike atmosphere in which every single sense is evoked. One of the primary symbolist poets of the time was Stéphane Mallarmé, who penned the poem of our text. And as we look closer at that text, we realize that there are a lot of very crystal clear images. We have weeping seraphim and a fairy that snows down white flowers. But as clear as those images are, they seem very loosely tethered to one another, which creates a very ethereal feeling that becomes very hard for us to actually grasp. That is until we look at the one line of text that shares something real, which is that it was the day of our first kiss. And now we realize that all of these loosely tethered images are a way of trying to describe that which should be absolutely indescribable, and yet evokes all of both our physical senses and our emotional senses as well, and even our memories. Debussy's handling of this text is perfectly in tune with Mallarmé's symbolist ideals. You can sense that there's definitely a direction, that the piece is always going somewhere, and that there are moments of climax and release that make it exciting to listen to. But instead of writing something that's strophic or repetitive, Debussy takes each one of Mallarmé's images and sets them with their own unique musical texture. And so he's really following along and living in each and every image and feeling that Mallarmé is trying to convey. He also approaches the music with the same dreamlike attitude that was very present in symbolist poetry. And he does that in a lot of ways by using different musical elements that make us feel as though we really aren't planted on solid ground. And one of the main ways he does that is with the harmony. In very, very, very simple music, such as nursery rhymes, for example, we are in one key. And that makes us feel very comfortable. And it's also part of what makes those songs so easy to hear and repeat. In slightly more sophisticated music, composers will change to at least one other key throughout the course of the song. But this is done according to a very specific set of rules. There's only specific keys that they will change to from one to another, and they'll only do it for a certain period of time, so that way we never feel too lost in what's going on, and they can bring us easily back to that original key and feeling that sense of grounding. By the time that Debussy was writing, composers were really beginning to experiment with harmony and all of the directions that keys and harmonies could go, but they were still more or less playing within the conventional rules. Debussy, however, starts taking these harmonies, changing them more often, and taking them in very unusual directions. So it feels like we're going one way, and then all of a sudden he changes route on us and we end up somewhere else. And by doing this, and by constantly changing the key, Debussy never allows us to actually feel grounded and settled until the very end of the song. We're constantly wandering around in this dreamlike atmosphere. He also carries this dreamlike feeling into the vocal line by using different scales. In Western music, the scales that we're most used to hearing are the major scale and the minor scale. And we use those two scales in particular because they have an almost magnetic pull to a tonality. We really sense where the grounding is. We sense where home is. We sense the key. But Debussy starts playing with pentatonic and whole tone scales. And with these scales, we don't get that same sense of grounding. They have a sense that they are wandering in a very different way. And so by doing this, even the vocal line starts taking unexpected turns. So we're really looking forward to sharing this piece with you. We can't wait to hear your thoughts, and we are thrilled to have the wonderful and lovely Vika Schwartzman to join us today.
Hi!
As we explore Debussy's Apparition. Of course, Apparition is just one of the many ways that Debussy experimented with symbolism. He certainly was drawn to it in terms of a lot of the poetry that he set for his art songs. So I hope you take some time and discover more Debussy and how he used symbolism, because it's certainly a repeated theme in his music. All right, we hope you enjoyed this dreamy Apparition. And if you did, you know what to do. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, push all the fun buttons, including that little notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And we will see you soon.